there's this idea that's been in my head of in search of a joyful Protestantism. And it kind of comes from my own experience, which, if people aren't familiar, goes something like, I was an evangelical Bible college student, and I stumbled into church history, and I fell in love. And I thought, this is all utterly fascinating, reading everything I can, and all of a sudden, beginning to see a lot that doesn't look like the non-denominational church that I grew up in. And that was a little jarring at first, but also kind of exciting, and maybe taking, warming myself to Catholicism or Orthodoxy, maybe taking in some insights from those practices, or even like maybe some devotional practice and whatnot, and just becoming very intrigued. And I think for a lot of people, it's a very exciting journey of discovery. There's all this stuff out there that I never knew about. But then for me, and I think probably for a lot of the people that are drawn to your work as well, you come across certain things that act as, if not like speed bumps, outright like do not pass go here, like the case studies you mentioned in your book of Mary's Assumption, or Iconodulia of, this just doesn't seem like a fair historical claim, so I don't think I could assent to being Catholic or Orthodox. But where that's left me at times, and where I think it's left other people, is a sense of like, I'm Protestant not necessarily because I'm really jazzed about being Protestant right now, but I can't be Catholic or Orthodox. So you stay Protestant. Yeah. So what I'm in search of, and what I think maybe other people are, is when you come across that kind of like roadblock, how do you find that joyful Protestant identity that embraces church history and can see the good of it all, but isn't just Protestant because you can't be something else? Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. Boy, this is such a great question that it's almost the kind of thing I would like want to spend 3 days talking about with you and like searching for an answer with you, than just sort of giving my thoughts off the cuff here, because it's such a large and important question that any answer I give in a few minutes is probably just going to gesture towards where we would eventually go. But a couple things come to my mind, and you tell me what you think. I'm curious for your thoughts all along the way here. But one thing, of course, whenever I'm thinking through questions like this, and I don't think this applies to what you're asking exactly, but it's probably worth saying for a viewer who might be in this place, and that is, make sure that this isn't an issue of general contentedness, where it's the grass is greener on the other side kind of syndrome. This can happen like just within Protestant churches, where I've known people who they change churches every 3 years, and you talk, and there's always something wrong that comes up. And we always want to make sure that actually anywhere we land and plant our feet, there will be a struggle for contentedness. There'll always be feelings of like, it's not perfect, and so I want to flag that for a viewer out there, just to be alert to that, be prayerful about that, make sure that's not the underlying reality. It can be a factor sometimes. Second thing is, looking at like, where people live. I have a lot of people who write me a email, and they'll say, I live in a rural area and there's 2 churches within driving distance, and so they don't have a lot of options. And then other people are in a context where there's a lot of local churches in their context, and so those kinds of variables are a huge factor in terms of where you might actually attend church. But if you're in a place where there are more options, there actually is a pretty wide swath within Protestantism, and you actually can find in many parts of the world Protestant churches that are basically on par with the non-Protestant traditions with respect to building architecture, liturgy, general aesthetics, etc. So that's just something for people to be aware of. In terms of theology, I think one thing I love to, if people are wondering like, okay, I feel like I probably should be Protestant because that's where my convictions incline at this point, but I'm looking for that joy of it. One thing I love to encourage people to do, and it's just kind of simple and what we've already talked about, but it's that searching for the riches and the good things within the Protestant tradition. So for me at church I previously served, that looked like doing a study on the Lord's Supper. You get Thomas Watson and about 4 other books, and we just get together on Saturday mornings and have breakfast, and we just study a Reformed view of the Lord's Supper, which is actually a really rich topic in terms of the quantity that's been written about it, the sense of mystery inherent within it, the practicality of it. Now it is affecting you during your worship directly. Charles Spurgeon was a Baptist pastor, and he said, the Lord's Supper is the closest we get to heaven in this life. I agree with Spurgeon. I think that I think the Lord's Supper is a place of unique intimacy with Christ. And so that's a wonderful thing. So studying that, I mean, he's a Baptist, but among the Reformed tradition, there's this strong emphasis upon the Lord's Supper. So if someone's discontent, they're looking for a joyful Protestantism. They feel somewhat settled there, but they're kind of looking to embrace it with their whole heart. I think diving into some of these areas of Protestant richness can really help you. And for example, like the way it can play out is if you're at a local church where you're not feeling like all of your desires are getting met, the Lord might use you as an agent of renewal within that context.
Yeah.
Because one of the things I always say is when we talk about renewal within the church, Protestant churches need renewal constantly because Christians need renewal constantly because we don't just automatically stay in a vibrant place with God or have automatic good theology irrespective of other factors. We need continual renewal. So if a person is doing this at their local church, they're diving into the Puritans, they're diving into the Lord's Supper. Maybe they feel like their church doesn't have a whole lot of liturgical depth or theological richness. Maybe the Lord is going to use them to help. What a great thing if that could happen. Better than just leaving to go somewhere or something, to stay where you are, if possible, and function as an agent. I'm using the word renewal. Maybe another word that comes to mind is of deepening. And my conviction, what I'm arguing for in the book, is you can do that as a Protestant. And I would say as well, the joyful Protestantism may also come in connection to fully exploring, just as you would if you weren't Protestant, the full of church history. Again, I want to emphasize this point that you can be a Protestant and be just as excited about church history.
Yeah.
I mean, Philip Schaff was a Protestant. Yeah, there we go. I mean, you can see the work, the labors of his hands. In fact, actually, it's interesting. Some of the leading scholars of church history have been Anglicans and other forms of Protestant, which is interesting. But, if someone is saying, well, I'm sort of drawn to these beautiful things, but I'm convictionally still Protestant, I would say just go for those beautiful things.
Yeah.
Unless those beautiful things are like, I have to become Roman Catholic specifically, in which case then we have these doctrinal conversations about why that versus, say, Anglican or Orthodox or something like that. We get into the doctrine there. But if it's just the general depth of church history, then I would say pursue that to the max. If you're in an ecclesial context where you feel limited to do that, that's where I could imagine someone just taking a personal deep dive into the writings of the Puritans. Mm-hmm. Just as one example. I mean, for me, I went through a little phase where I read John Owen's commentary on Hebrews. And I remember having the thought, he wrote an 8-volume commentary on Hebrews, pretty deep. And I remember having the thought as I was working through it, this is so rich. This is like a castle with more rooms than you can count. It's like you're never going to get out of this. It's endless. It's a maze, but it's also intricate and devotional and beautiful and actually kind of scholarly in its own way. The Puritans had this writing style that was so organized and yet so practical and devotional as well. So like I can imagine encouraging someone to say, do a deep dive in something like John Owen's commentary on Hebrews, just as one possible example. It's not going to solve every problem, but it's one way you can try to meet some of that hunger and some of that thirst. And I think there's joy in that. Doesn't solve every problem. I don't know, but let's keep going on this, or how else can we talk about this?
Yeah, I mean, well, the first thing I'm delighted is that Eliza heard that, so I need John Owen's 8-volume set now. You've given me permission to buy it, so I appreciate that. No, but
you heard it here.
I think there's a couple things that I can say about my own journey that have been helpful, and then maybe we can keep pressing into it too for people who are there, because I think that's a really disorienting place to be. But I'll say something that has been helpful for me was, when I got really excited about these things, I'd look into like Catholic prayer books or Orthodox prayer books, and I would try that, but there's always something like, I'm not sure I can go all the way there. There's elements of those devotional practices that would make me uncomfortable. And then I picked up a copy of the 1662 Book of Common Prayer and felt this sense of like relief of, I have no qualms with any of this. But it's still just as beautiful. It's still just as rich. And so I think that's an example of finding kind of the beauty within Protestantism. And I love the point about not immediately church hopping and moving around. One thing that we're planning on doing this fall is leading a group on the Apostolic Fathers in our rather very contemporary non-denominational church that we attend. But to be a person that can kind of bring people into that. But I think you have to have a certain amount of comfort where you are in order to do that. Because I think some people, they just want something. They want that fullness. They see such beauty, and I think oftentimes only look at the best as well. Yeah. Like they're comparing Aquinas to their pastor down the street, and Aquinas wins every time. Yeah. But I think where it gets difficult for people is perhaps when they feel that they don't have any sense of organic connection to church history. Because I think that's what a lot of people are looking for, and they feel like Protestants, maybe if it was there historically, it's just not there today. Like no one around them is interested in these things. They might say that it's great that Spurgeon had a certain view of the Lord's Supper, but they can't find a Baptist around them that has a similar view. Or they might say, oh, it's great that there's beautiful like Episcopal liturgies, but the theology is not conservative. Or they can't find that full depth of it, and they think rather than having to like find this one niche church that actually does it, like I could just become Catholic or Orthodox and I would have it all, seemingly, right? And so I guess for those people that are saying like, I don't want to have to reinvent the wheel. Like I don't want to have to introduce new writings to people that they haven't read before. Like I just want to enter into a steady stream of tradition where I'm not kind of forcing something new to happen. How do you respond to that? Because I think there's a really strong pull to, okay, yes, I could try to find all this in Protestantism, like maybe piecemeal it together. But if I go to the Orthodox church down the street, it's going to have a beautiful liturgy. It's going to be connected to the church fathers. And I'm not going to have to convince people that this actually is the Protestant patrimony too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hear what you're asking there. And so it sounds like if someone is articulating the struggle like this, where, their perception is in a Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox context, it will just be more natural to sort of have this sort of rootedness and liturgy that I'm aching for. Whereas here, I'd have to kind of piecemeal it together. I would say that my perception, for whatever it's worth, is that the contrast there is not so absolute. Mm-hmm. And I'll say this with absolute love and respect for Christians in every different tradition, but I just see the pros and the cons as sort of more, for my estimation, kind of more scattershot.
Yeah.
So I would say, and I have seen a lot of people, they will move from one tradition to another with the expectation that it will just be so natural, and they realize actually it sometimes maybe some have that experience. I've heard people say that too, but I've also heard people feel like, I have all the same struggles here.
Sure.
And
or if not the same, an equal amount of different struggles. Yeah.
Exactly. That could also be the case. Yeah. Totally. Yeah. So I mean, so that's, and I'm not saying that on anybody else. I'm just saying my perception is that, and because as I look at the Protestant landscape, maybe it's because I grew up in a Presbyterian context, and since I left Presbyterianism, but benefited so much from it. I love to use it as a positive example. Love my Presbyterian friends. But I had such a great experience in Presbyterianism. Mm-hmm. I was catechized so well. I got a lot of church history. We said the Lord's Prayer and the Apostles' Creed and sang these rich hymns every single Sunday. It was rich. It was meaningful. It was powerful. And that's just right here in the United States at a Presbyterian church. And I think that's actually out there a lot more. And I don't think, if someone has the idea, they got to piece it together to get depth and liturgy and rootedness. If you're a Protestant context, maybe they live in a really rural context. Maybe they're sort of making that observation based upon their own sort of anecdotal efforts, but there's more out to Protestantism they haven't seen yet. Protestantism is pretty big and pretty diverse. There's a lot out there. So I guess I just see a lot more. I'd be puzzled. I'd be a bit mystified at this idea that if you're a Protestant, you have to sort of piece things together to get this. I would say actually it is pretty natural. I mean, one of the reasons for that is that's just what Protestants have always historically done. Like historically, Protestants had for the most part, weekly communion and a really high view of communion as the climactic moment in the church service, and that still is the case for many Protestants today. So, I'm not piecing it together. I guess I would just say maybe that's some people's experience. My feeling is there's actually more opportunity for a more organic and happy possibility to do that in Protestant contexts. But I acknowledge too, maybe there's some places where people can't, and that's where maybe my comments about trying to be an agent of renewal can be. Of course, at the end of the day, with all of this, there's these truth considerations.
Right.
You know, we have to follow our conscience for what we believe is true, and that's sort of a backstop there. But I like to think that the Holy Spirit isn't going to say to somebody, well, I know it's really great over there, but you don't believe in the bodily assumption of Mary, so you can't go there, so you're stuck over here. You know, like, I don't think that's how the Lord leads us. And so, and I, you know, again, my experience has been in Protestant contexts, you can have some of the most wonderful, even encounters with church history. Like my growing up in Presbyterianism, we just spent a lot of time in, especially reading the Puritans. Like I remember I in college, I was a part of a Reformed campus ministry. And even there, we were like reading, kind of weird, but we were reading like John Owen, you know, and some of these books in the Puritan paperback series. My opinion, they're second to none in terms of devotional theology. So I guess that's one thing I also just want to keep emphasizing is there's a lot of richness in this tradition to be harnessed. And even where there's richness in the non-Protestant traditions, you can still enjoy that as a Protestant.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed this clip. If you did, you'll probably enjoy the full interview too, which you can find here. And if you haven't already, you should consider subscribing, which you can do here. Lastly, if you are bought into the vision of gospel simplicity, which is bringing simplicity out of theological and historical complexity, you can support the channel by going to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity or clicking on the link in the description down below. Thanks, and God bless.